Hi, everyone. Welcome to Act to be Rapt. My name is Aurora Elms, and today I'm going to be interviewing Dr. David Armstrong. Dr. Armstrong is a professor emeritus of medicine and sociology at King's College, London. His current research includes the sociology of medical knowledge, changing clinicians' behavior, health service evaluations, and the effect of microbiota on health. He is the author of Political Anatomy of the Body, Medical Knowledge in Britain in the 20th Century, published by Cambridge University Press in 1983, and A New History of Identity, A Sociology of Medical Knowledge, published by Palgrave in 2002. Here. So, David, today we're going to be talking about surveillance and how surveillance comes to have an effect on how we construct ourselves, who we are, the identities that we create from being surveilled. And this whole discussion is emerging because we have a common interest in Foucault, Michel Foucault, a French philosopher who wrote a famous book called Discipline and Punish, The Birth of the Prison. And in that book, Foucault talks about the Panopticon prison model. I was wondering if you could summarize Foucault's description of the Panopticon as a way for us to sort of begin to broach this discussion of surveillance.
Yes, thank you, Aurora. Well, the Panopticon was a prison designed by Jeremy Bentham, an 18th century philosopher. It was designed by him, but it was never actually built, though, in fact, as we'll see, its model pervaded Western societies for the next 2 centuries. The Panopticon involved a big enclosed space with a central tower, and around the edge of this space were lots of cells which could be observed from that central tower. And so the prisoners sat in those cells and could be observed by the guards who were in the central tower. Now, this contrasts with what Foucault described earlier in his book, where he looked at the way a criminal who tried to kill the King of France, how that criminal was treated, who was hung, drawn, and quartered. There was a huge crowd there. It was very exciting. There was a big event, and everybody watched this prisoner being tortured and eventually killed. And Foucault says, what happened between seeing that spectacle of torture through to the prison where you just sat in a prison cell and were observed? And he suggested this shift involved a change in the mechanism of power. So in the former, when the prisoner was treated like that, what you were seeing was the power of the king. So the king, through the soldiers, the magistrates, the officers, and so on, was inflicting all this pain on the individual prisoner through the power of the king. It was a spectacle, and that's the way kings are seen, through spectacle, through processions and rituals and so on. Now, the difference with the Panopticon is the prisoner is simply being observed. There's no punishment, there's no beating, there's no physical molestation of that patient's body. Instead, the prisoner is being observed from that central tower. And Foucault suggests this is a new mechanism of power. So the prisoner sitting in their cell, being observed, you can imagine it yourself, if you are being observed, you're careful about what you do. I'm being observed now by this camera. So there's certain things I might not do in public because I know I'm being observed. So in other words, you start to constrain your behavior because you're being observed. And Foucault suggests that this whole model then becomes what he called disciplinary power. We become disciplined bodies through this mechanism. Now, the other interesting thing about the Panopticon is the central tower was covered with shutters, so the prisoner couldn't see whether or not they were being observed.
Yes.
And I think that was crucial because it was what Foucault called a disembodied gaze. You couldn't see who was looking at you, but you could be being watched. So next time you go into the supermarket, you can see the camera up there looking at you, but is there anybody looking at the screen? Yes. We don't know, but we're constantly aware there could be. So this is the basis of disciplinary power. And Foucault said that although that panoptic building was never actually, Bentham's Panopticon was never built, if you look at 19th century schools, hospitals, prisons, workshop, they all had this panoptic principle where you have surveillance. Somebody is sitting there, You don't have to know who it is, but somebody in the classroom is observing you. Somebody in those big wards is observing you. Someone in the prison is observing you. So the whole idea that discipline started to instill Western bodies at the very end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century, and give us the anatomical body that we understand today. So that's always been my start. I read that book. Oh, it was an amazing experience. You just read about, and it's a very readable book. I can recommend it. And there's a whole chapter on the Panopticon, which is a beautiful chapter describing how this was almost like a machine for creating disciplined bodies. Incredible, really.
Absolutely. So Foucault wrote about this prison model called the Panopticon, but he also wrote extensively about other institutional models of control, such as schools, that manage children's conduct, give rewards for good behavior, and enable efficiency without the use of forced confinement. Despite the fact that the Panopticon as a prison model, as you said, was never really officially implemented by governments, and Foucault himself acknowledged that the model doesn't capture everything about surveillance, many people still find it a compelling concept to describe contemporary life. So I have a couple of questions all sort of mixed into one. Are we confined in any way? Is the Panopticon still a compelling blueprint, even if insufficient on its own, for explaining how bodies are disciplined?
Yes, I think it is still a model which I find amazing. This machine, if you like, which I see it as a machine for creating bodies, appeared at as I said, the end of the 18th century, and in a sense has expanded out of a building into the whole of society. So those surveillance techniques that were pioneered in the Panopticon have now spread everywhere. So we're all subjected to, which I'm sure we'll discuss further, we're subjected to surveillance in our lives all the time. Now, the important thing about sovereign power, where the power of the king, it was very repressive. If you broke the law, the king was on you like a ton of bricks, and you got hung, drawn, and quartered and everything. But the disciplinary power was creative. It didn't block you. It didn't prevent you. It actually made you into something new. And that to me is very important. So whenever we talk about surveillance, we're talking about a creative power that actually fashions us into who we are. That's the important thing. It doesn't repress us. It doesn't negate us. It turns us into something new, and in many ways, more full. Well, I guess we've got to say that because that's what we've become. But we are a shadow of our former selves because of these disciplinary procedures. So rather than seeing this in negative terms, which we usually see power as, oh, it's going to block us and prevent our freedom and do all these things, instead of doing that, this gives us freedom. This gives us our identity. This gives us who we are.
Very interesting. We're going to take up this theme again.
Yeah.
So the Panopticon is operational. And as you said, the Panopticon model was the model of the tower in the middle of the prison. And this was never implemented, but it was a vision as a blueprint. The tower's in the middle of the prison, and all the cells are circumnavigating that tower. That the watch guard can always, at any time, potentially see the prisoners, and the prisoners are in cells where they cannot escape the gaze.
Exactly.
There's nowhere in the cell that they can escape the gaze. When we think of Shawshank Redemption, where Andy is able to get out of prison because he is not, there is times when he is not seen. In the Panopticon model, that is not the case. You are always observed. It's ubiquity. It's everywhere. Right? So talking about these confined spaces and forced confinement, we know that prison, manages people and regulates people, but we don't always think that surveillance in society, like, CCTV, cameras everywhere, even in tech, how we're being watched all the time for different reasons. We don't always see it as a kind of forced confinement, but I would like to talk a little bit about the relationship between surveillance and self-discipline and self-regulation, and the relationship between surveillance and habits. Because when you are a prisoner in the Panopticon model, and you're there and you can't escape anywhere in the room being seen, you have already indicated that it instigates creative processes within the person being surveilled. But are those creative processes mainly conducted through self-discipline, or maybe I'll just answer.
Yeah, I mean, self-discipline as an overall category, I think summarizes it well. And I think what's happened since the Panopticon, which you can see it working in the Panopticon, you've got to think would be the most efficient mechanism for self-discipline? What's the most efficient surveillance technique you can think of? And it isn't the camera, it isn't the tower in the middle of the prison. The best surveillance technique you can possibly think of is yourself. Yes. Why don't we persuade people to survey themselves? What a brilliant, brilliant strategy for creating ourselves. So we do increasingly survey ourselves. We are responsible for monitoring ourselves. And I think the term reflexivity in the modern world, the postmodern world, since the last 50 years, we've been this term of reflexivity. We reflect on who we really are. We've got to think about who we are and how we react with the world. And that process of reflexivity is a type of self-surveillance. Many years ago, my son came back with his school report on maths. It wasn't very good. But alongside the school report on maths from his teacher, there was his own report. He thought he was very good at it. The teacher didn't. But it was his own report. He had to start thinking about how he was performing. We all undergo, well, I've skipped that now, but we all used to undergo annual appraisal systems. And what's an appraisal system? It's about reflecting on how you are doing, how you're working. Educational techniques for adults and for children these days gets them to reflect on how well they're doing. So it isn't enough to just simply get a mark and go, you got 8 out of 10. It's about how do you think you're achieving things? Mm-hmm. So in other words, we become self-reflective, reflexive beings. We internalize surveillance to monitor ourselves. And I think that's been the remarkable shift over 200 years. We have become self-surveying animals. So although the cameras are still there, there's still those elements of the Panopticon still around us. People with, I know I'm being observed when I walk down the street. It much more important is the fact I'm sitting here, and when this camera is off, I'm observing myself. Isn't that wonderful? Brilliant.
Yes. And so what does that self-control or that self-regulation achieve? What benefits are there for us by creatively managing ourselves and
well, it gives us aspects of our identity, I guess, which we didn't have before. I'll give you another example. If you look at 19th century psychiatry and you look at any textbook on 19th century psychiatry, it is entirely concerned with madness. That was the only disease. There's lots of subtypes of madness, but essentially it was people who'd lost their reason, and that was the main one. Mm-hmm. At the beginning of the 20th century, there's a new category of mental illness emerges, which we now call the neuroses, familiar as depression and anxiety. Now, the difference is with madness, you're either mad or you're sane. With depression and anxiety, we've all got a bit. I've got a bit of anxiety. You've got a bit of depression. We've all got a little bit of it. Sometimes it becomes clinical. That is, it goes too far. But we all must manage our emotions. So what better way to instill in us a sense that we have emotions, that we must manage these, that we are emotional beings, but to devise neuroses which need to be monitored by medical people, by social workers, by psychologists, by teachers. Everyone must manage the neuroses, but above all, ourselves. We've got to manage our own feelings. And so we then start to manage our feelings. So in a sense, we develop faculties, we develop aspects of ourselves that we didn't have before. So in the 19th century, we had, I suppose we had different characters. In the 20th century, you have personalities. We have things that we didn't have before are part of our identity that weren't there before. So I think that's the big shift, and how we have, as the title of this is, how surveillance has changed who we are.
Right. So there's personal benefits to self-regulation, and there's social benefits to self-regulation. When you adhere to social norms, there are social rewards.
Yes, but in a sense, of course, the world we've created, we see as a good thing, capital G, capital T. It's a good thing because we've created, and we think that's a good thing. But the world we've lost, if you like, going back to those people who weren't disciplined, who ran after in the public spectacle of the punishment, they were free in a different way. They had different things going on inside there. I mean, I can't access them because they lived in a completely different world. So we have created a new world, but whether it's better or worse, again, I'm reluctant to get drawn on that. A few thousand years ago, the giraffe evolved. Was that a good thing or a bad thing? It evolved. We got giraffes. We didn't have giraffes, and now we have giraffes, and maybe they'll become extinct. We won't have giraffes. I mean, we'll say if we become extinct, that's a bad thing because we like giraffes. But there's nothing inherently good about having giraffes in the world. It's our value judgment about what's important. So we tend to judge the way we are today, reflexive beings, as a good thing. The more reflexive you can be, the better. So we will, as you say, we will reward a child who is reflexive. We will reward a patient who is reflexive, who thinks about who they are, how they influence other people, and how they're behaving, and what their habits and so on are.
Right. Yeah, I mean, living under a monarch and not being able to peep and against them, right, is one kind of living. And as long as you stay under the radar, then you can basically live how you like. But then, today we have not coercive control in the same way. We live in democracies, many of us. But is the disciplining forces of surveillance, are they really democratized? Are they really democratizing? I mean, I think there's some people who don't get looked at quite the same way as others. The masses are being observed on a much wider extent, and there's people who can afford it and who have the means, who can escape the gaze. They can find ways around it. They know how to avoid it, and they come onto screen, just not caring about social norms to quite the extent because they wield a level of economic or social power. Anyway, I wanted to. Maybe we can bring that up again, but I wanted to ask my next question, which is related. So some have suggested that in the second part of the 20th century, surveillance shifted from oversight over bodies to oversight over minds. What does it mean to surveil the mind? Who or what is doing this?
Well, it's a bit like in the Panopticon. I go back to the Panopticon. Who was doing it? There wasn't anyone doing it. In a sense, there was the warders in the central tower, but they themselves were under surveillance by the managers, and they were in a hierarchy of surveillance as well. And as I said, they didn't even have to be there. So the whole world gets caught up in this network of surveillance. Now, how does this extend in the 20th century? In many ways, although ethically we're not meant to do it, I think we first experiment with children. We take children, innocent children, and we experiment with them and see what they can do. So at the beginning of the 20th century, for the first time, schools introduce physical education. Now, you don't give physical education to your cat or your canary or your dog because they know how to do it. Human beings know how to move, but we don't know how to move. We must be taught how to move. So hence physical education. And the start off for physical education was the position of standing to attention. Now, standing to attention is the most unnatural position you can imagine, but all children were taught to stand to attention before they then started to move in various ways. And of course, going into the interwar years, there's those mass demonstrations of athletics, a bit like you see in North Korea today, where people are doing all this synchronized activity together to show how their bodies could be trained, could be educated to behave in a way which was unnatural, in some ways. But this is what happened with education. And because of work with children, we then extended it into adults. And so adults started to, got the start of the Olympics, we got the new sports coming along, we got people going hiking and camping. All those things happen in the interwar years because their newfound freedom to express their bodies had happened.
Yes.
Now, as well as this sort of physical development through the 20th century, we also have the beginnings with the mental development, if you can call it that, where, as I said, we have the neuroses, where people have got neuroses, but especially in childhood. This is a dangerous period, and there's a whole concept, which comes about mid-century, there's a concept of the normal child comes about. So we're absolutely concerned with normality. And I remember I had one of my children was particularly small, I think it was, or short, I can't remember. And I remember they were on the growth height charts, they were sort of 98th percentile or 2 percentile, I can't remember what it was. And I remember saying to the pediatrician, is this normal? And of course, there isn't a response to that. Oh, it's just 2%. Everything is normal because it's all on the curve.
Yes.
So every child becomes a normal child. And if you look at the pediatric textbooks, they've got chapters on problems of the normal child. Well, in a sense, if you've got problems, you're not a normal child, but you are, because everyone is normal. So we have this normalizing gaze that everyone becomes normal. Children are not allowed, can't be abnormal any longer. They must be normalized. And, there's the various techniques for doing that. As I said, getting children in schools. Nowadays, children in schools are encouraged to express themselves. Before they had to shut up, now they're encouraged to express themselves. We're all encouraged to express ourselves. And in a way, the only crime now is silence. And you suggested that people can escape the gaze. I doubt they can. Well, they can't escape themselves. They can't escape. I know they're rich and powerful, but they can't escape themselves. Now, there are some people who probably do escape the gaze because, and so we search them out in terms of, we send our social workers into those slums to find people. We send people in there to help them, inverted commas, but that is to make them subject to the gaze. So we pull them out and we say, what's it feel like to be in a slum? We qualitative research, we ask them, interview them and say, what's it like? Tell us about that experience and so on. And in doing that, we reconstruct them. So, yeah, maybe stop there. Yeah.
So it's gone from sort of physical manifestations of disciplinary observance to mental expressions of disciplinary observance, meaning that we self-regulate to gain benefits, and we are told certain narratives about normality, whatever is along the curve. Those people that are in the bulge of the curve, those people are normal. Yeah. And anyone who goes into the two ends of that bell curve, the outliers are subject to potentially some in more intensified kinds of control or surveillance or invalidation or delegitimacy or whatever. So we have ourselves in a state of surveillance where the most efficient form and method of surveillance is for us to surveil ourselves, for us to correct when we know that we are deviating from a particular norm or a particular social expectation. I once heard someone say that contemporary social media produces in people this confessionalism, where they feel socially obligated to discuss the minutiae of their lives for social rewards. Isn't confession also a technique of surveillance? So we have people self-regulating. We have people controlling their behavior in certain ways, especially when they know that they're being seen. And even when they know they're not being seen, they're still controlling their behavior. They're observing certain expectations, rules, ways of behaving, habits. But what is the role of confessing in the surveillance sort of mechanism? What's that relationship?
Yeah. Well, back to the Panopticon. And in the Panopticon, what was being observed was the prisoners' behavior, how they moved, their physical shape. But they could have, secretly, these thoughts, which, I disagree with this guard, or I disagree with this regime. They could have all these thoughts,
Yes.
which, the authorities might not think were desirable or whatever. So the technique, almost like functionalist explanation, but the technique is to get people to reveal these thoughts. So what thoughts do you have? Not because I'm going to condemn them, but because by expressing them, you can be aware of what thoughts. It's all part of that self-awareness, that reflexivity. You can become aware of those thoughts. So Foucault did point out that the confession had been invented way back. I think the Catholic Church was using confessions, but usually you use confessions to either reveal sins or you use confessions to reveal secrets.
Yes.
Nowadays, we use Facebook or we phone in the local chat show, whatever, to reveal trivia about our lives. But it's part of that confession. We have all become confessing animals. And the more we confess, the more we want to confess, but the more we construct ourselves. So I think that the confession is a very important part of that process. I once did a study on looking at, I work in the medical area, looking at how doctors had interviewed patients over the last sort of 100 years, looking at the textbooks about explaining how doctors should approach a patient to get a history from them before they examine them, and how they should talk to patients. And at the very beginning, it actually was called interrogation. So the doctor had to interrogate the patient and ask them what symptoms they had, when they started, all these sorts of things. And then in the 1940s, there's a switch towards saying, well, if the patient says something, you've got to get them to explore it a bit more. It isn't just about symptoms of disease. It's about what's in the patient's mind.
Right.
And increasingly, I mean, I was involved in it. I was doing some teaching in that area. You try and elicit the patient's views about their illness, because that's a very important part of treatment. They've got to know about what they think they've got, what they think the right therapy is, before you start to intervene in that. So a good doctor these days will interview a patient rather than interrogate them, and ask them to express themselves in some way. And it's that expressing themselves, and you do it, I do it quite innocuously. It isn't as if I feel, oh, this is intrusive or anything. I just occasionally get an older patient who will think, why are you asking about how I feel, doctor? I've come with a sore throat. But the doctor said, well, how do you feel in yourself? And that's a very important question, because that person hasn't really, I haven't really thought about that, doctor. I thought I just have a sore throat. How I feel? Well, I'm feeling a bit miserable, actually, now you mention it, and off to go. So as soon as you've got that confessional, you're instilling in somebody that they have those feelings that they confess. So it's a way of eliciting, about generating the very thing that you're asking them to talk about.
So there's narratives that are floating in the world about the way things are. But confessionalism is its own kind of narrative that talks back to us. So it's like we don't really acknowledge a thought until it gets externalized.
Yes.
Right? So
Sure. Yeah.
When we say a thought, suddenly now we're aware of it.
Yes.
In a much different way than when it's just floating in our brains, right?
Yes, exactly.
And so the confessionalism part and saying what we really think, we're actually, when we are compelled to do that, we are actually building narratives about ourselves, building narratives about our place in the world, and also collectively building narratives through the collective forms of confessionalism.
Indeed, absolutely.
You see on social media that that vulnerability is considered to be to have great social benefits on social media. That when we are honest with our plight and when we express it and externalize it, people can identify with that vulnerability, and that has many benefits. It is, people have built their whole careers, their whole businesses on vulnerability. At the same time, we're and the nice thing about it is that as a collective unit, as we talk amongst ourselves on social media and we learn about other people's struggles, it makes our struggles not seem as terrible. We know that there's other people who can relate to what we're talking about. But at the same time, we are revealing things about our lives, which if we were not in such a kind of social soup, we may not do that. We may not be like back in the day, around the times of monarchies, and even in many parts of the world, it's understood that the village knows your stuff. It's understood that the village people get into your business. Now we're very atomized. We're very individualized. Our societies are very not always. I mean, our collective integration and our collective engagement with each other is shifting. We are not necessarily knowing our neighbor, but we are still engaged in volunteer work. We're still engaged in activities which have a sociality kind of component. So whereas before the village would kind of know everything about us, and family members would be intruding on our lives and, telling us what we should be doing in a particular predicament. Now we don't really have so much of those relationships with our neighbors, but we still have a situation where we are self-regulating, self-confessing, and then drawing people into our worlds, drawing people into our problems for certain psychological benefits, social benefits. I'm just wondering your thoughts on that.
I think you said it very well. It is intriguing. I haven't really thought about it before, that in a way vulnerability is an important part of one's presentation of self.
Yeah.
And this facilitates things. If I go back to the village, they knew all about everyone in the village in those sort of medieval days, but there was no individuality. There was everybody was a part of that whole. It was as if you knew the whole village and you knew all those bits of it, but there was no individuality. What's different today is all of those people who are in the global village are all there because they're individuals, and they're all performing as individuals, and they're all getting out of it something that reinforces their individuality. I don't think anybody is lost in terms of, just into that goo of sociability. They're all still separate individuals with their own vulnerabilities, their own anxieties, their own problems, and so on. And the fact that you hear somebody else's problems doesn't mean that you don't have problems. It just is that part. I've listened to their confession. Maybe it's my turn to confess, or they've told us something about one aspect of their life. Maybe I can tell them about that aspect of my life as well. Mm-hmm. So yes, actually, it's quite a nice analysis you've got there. I haven't really sort of engaged with thought about social media, but I guess that's the way it works. Is exactly as you described. I should write about, or you should write about that.
So, David, I mean, okay, so the medieval times of village, people wouldn't be individuated because they were just part of and they would be largely wearing the same clothes and stuff like that.
Yeah,
what about the elites? What about the Russian elites, the British elites, those who had the means? Is this a class thing? Because at a class level, they could get the fancy dresses. They were going to the balls. They were going and wearing the feathers in their hats. They were able to individuate themselves a little bit more than those who were the peasantry, who were wearing just what everyone else was wearing.
Yes.
So have we, in the emergence of the middle class, and sort of the transformation of class across the centuries, especially if we're talking about the northern hemisphere, the Western world, the dynamics are different in the global South, not in all cases, but in some cases. And so, is it the case that we are at this crossroads of emerging middle class, a massive socioeconomic capacity to individuate, and while at the same time we have mechanisms, governmental, corporate, which are finding benefit at a policy level, ostensibly, at a policy level, and also for profit reasons, to want us to reveal our troubles or want us to reveal our issues so that they can be mitigated. Meaning that at the government level, we are asked we are not surveilled heavily if we don't reveal troubles. But the second we reveal troubles, we become an object of the gaze, intensification of the gaze.
Yes.
At the corporate level, they tell us, reveal the things about you so that the algorithms can give you what you need.
Mm-hmm.
Right? If you are confessional about your mental health crises, about you being a single mom during coronavirus times, having to look after your kids, and you're having a mental breakdown, that you confess that, and you write a big long statement, and you get 1,000 people responding to that post, and suddenly the algorithm picks you up, sees the content of your post, and is now giving you services for mental health. So the corporate sector would say, we are solving your problem through technological innovation, and that technological innovation is being enabled by your confessionalism.
Mm-hmm.
We are at a crossroads now where the middle class, it is much more socioeconomically advanced than it ever was. We have comforts that we never had in 200 years ago. But at the same time, I'm sure you can probably mention this, or say something about this, that our mental health crises are at its highest at a time when the expectation of confessionalism is at its highest. People, I resonate when people talk about their mental health issues or whatever. I resonate. I say, thank you for saying that, because I can't articulate what you're describing. But at the same time, I know that is not it's not without its caveats. That we identify with each other, we build sociality between each other, we build kind of a collective experience from that confessionalism, but it is capitalized upon.
Yes. So, two sort of ways of responding to what you just said. First of all, they're clearly, let's go back to olden days when there were the peasants who were in their village, but then there were also the people, the rich people who were flaunting around with power. Now, in a sense, that they had sovereign power. Their link to power was through sovereignty. The medieval world, or whatever, was governed by sovereign power. So the closer you were to the king and that sort of authority, the more power you were going to have. So it always cascaded down. So the king had, absolute power, and then the nobles and so on. It went all the way down. But all power came ultimately from sovereignty.
Right.
Now, Foucault has suggested that we have, in this era of disciplinary power, we have yet to cut off, he says famously in one of his books, we have yet to cut off the head of the king, because sovereign power still exists. Yes, it is still there. And I think part of what you're talking about is sovereign power. So there are people with sovereign power who use that sovereign power. My point would be that if you have to put in the balance, I don't know, somewhere like Russia, where sovereign power is, in Putin, it's a very strong force, or in China, where the emperor is still there with sovereign power and ruling the whole country. Yes. But if you had to put in the balance their sovereign power versus the disciplinary power that runs through Russian or Chinese society, the disciplinary power is far more pervasive, is far more important, is far, far greater. So I'm not denying that sovereign power is still there, but this other form of power is much, much more important. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that when capitalism exploits our confessional, which you've suggested, very often that exploitation is to enable us to confess even more. It's to So, a company gets hold of my confessional and says, you can be sold mindfulness therapy online. Oh, that's a good idea. I can then confess a bit more.
Yes.
So they actually want to sell me the new technique, these technological solutions to my confession. So instead of confessing to my, in the supermarket, I can confess to thousands of people all the way around the world. Isn't that wonderful? As I'm doing now.
Very fascinating.
Yeah.
People's self-regulation is a very fascinating thing to watch. And I myself do it too, even though I'm aware of that it's happening. I put up a post and then not sure how it's received, or I'm not sure that I am articulating a point that is helping or is interesting. And so I might take it down.
Yeah.
So I want to talk to you about agency, because we've discussed back and forth over email this idea of agency and of freedom. Agency is the ability to act, the capacity to act. So for you, what conditions have to be put in place for people to have agency or to have control over their existence? Stated differently, what do people have to be aware of in order to develop autonomy and live in freedom?
Well, yeah, I think it comes back to the idea of reflexivity, because if one is reflexive, then one has autonomy and freedom, inverted commas, because there's lots of different sorts of freedom. One has. I did look at this question in medicine a few years ago, when I looked, first of all, at the concept of agency. Where did that come from? The whole idea of agency. And in the early 20th century, the word is around, but it mainly refers to things like the Central Intelligence Agency, or it's government agencies as a service provider.
Right.
But the idea we have individual agency is a much more recent phenomenon and a much more recent concern.
Okay.
And so what I pointed out was that in the 1950s, the patient went to the doctor. They were expected to just recite all their ailments and then listen to the doctor and behave themselves, and just do exactly what the doctor said. And so that was in the early 1950s. And there was a paper, a study I picked up, I think published in about 1959, but there was others around at the same time. But I used that particular model where this epidemiologist said, he says, we've got to do more screening for illness. It's no good waiting for people to get illness before they come to see doctors. We've got to get them to think about whether they might be ill. Now, this wasn't necessarily having symptoms. This was thinking that you could have symptoms. Now, that's a really interesting thought. When I've got a symptom, I've got a pain, I've got a headache, or I've got a pain in my chest, I've got a symptom. I know that I could be ill. But sitting here and I've got to think I could have symptoms and I don't even realize it. I could have tuberculosis, but I don't even realize it. So that belief that you were susceptible to illness began to grow in people, that somehow they are at risk, but they didn't know how or where. The concept of being at risk emerged in the early 1960s, where we think everything's at risk. The idea of pollution in the natural world, Rachel Carson's book of, I think, 58, was it? All occurs about the same time. So we live in a world of risk. And how do I handle risk, which is all around me? And the only way to do it is through vigilance. I've got to be eternally vigilant, which is reflexive, about all the events that are happening around me. And of course, medicine helps with this, because it then starts, instead of doctors telling you what you should do in terms of medication, they will offer you the chance to discuss your medication. Instead of telling you what your disease is, they will discuss what the options are, and so on. So all these things happen. And then we get, in the 1970s, we get medical ethics, and ethics comes along for the first time. We get medical ethics, which says that one of the key attributes of patienthood is patient autonomy. What a wonderful idea, that patients should be autonomous. Nobody before 1970, if you scan in, autonomy into the New England Journal of Medicine or the British Medical Journal or whatever, the word does not occur, because nobody thought about autonomy being an important part of identity of patienthood. So it appears in the 1970s, and then it becomes a goal in itself. So the autonomous patient is a goal in itself now. So if you've got a chronic disease, what you really should be doing is self-managing that disease. It's not for medicine to look after your diabetes. It's for you to look after your diabetes in terms of medication, in terms of diet, in terms of whatever. So increasingly, we all become our own practitioners, because we've got to look after our own health. It's not for medicine to look after our health. We've all got to do it because we have become autonomous agents. We have agency. And I also looked up, I just found that the concept of agency also occurs in economics, in sociology. There's a whole raft of different disciplines where the concept of agency being an important human attribute begins to occur in the 1960s and onwards. It isn't there beforehand. So why weren't people concerned about agency? Because it didn't exist. People weren't concerned about it. But now we say it's terribly important to be autonomous, to be agentic is terribly important, and that's a good thing. Well, of course it's a good thing because that's the way I am. But it wasn't a bad thing in 1930 because nobody thought of it. Because that's not the way we were. So we couldn't construe ourselves in those terms and make evaluations of who we are in those terms because the language, the concepts, the notion didn't exist.
So do you see that there's a little bit of an irony between those people who are very individualistic and they say, we want to have autonomy over our choices. We don't want to wear a mask during coronavirus. And is that inclination to deny on an individual, it's an irony because on an individual level, they are saying that they want to have freedom. They would saying they want to have autonomy, saying they want to have a right of control of their face and all this stuff. At the same time, they are denying the existence of asymptomatic kind of expressions of coronavirus, and they're denying that coronavirus is even present. So are they, on the one hand, claiming agency but actually lacking agency because they are denying the asymptomatic factors of coronavirus that they could actually, if they accepted that realization, they could be more in control of their reality, but they're actually relinquishing control on the grounds or on the premises of wanting to have autonomy. It's like they want to have autonomy, they want to, but then they're actually relinquishing it because they're subjecting themselves to a virus because they're unwilling to have agency over their own health.
Yep. No, I think the irony is there, but I don't think the irony is about it's the importance of the virus. The virus doesn't matter. The important thing is that you express agency. So if I wear a mask, I'm expressing agency. If I refuse to wear a mask, I'm expressing agency. But for each of so if you get two people, one wearing and one not, and you say, why are you doing it? It's because they're expressing agency. Now, again, if you went back to somebody in 1930 or 1830 and said, why are you doing something? I'm not sure how they would have responded, because they couldn't have said, because I'm expressing my right to not wear a mask. I'm expressing my right to be an agent, to be able to do all these things. So I think manifestations of agency take all different forms, right. And we might look at them and say, oh, they're contradictory, but they're just different manifestations of agency. It's not that one's good, one's bad. It comes out in different ways. So of course there is. Foucault did describe at some places, he talked about resistance to the gaze, and can you resist the gaze? This, whether it's in the Panopticon or the TV, the CCTV camera, or somebody inviting you to talk about your feelings, can you resist? And you can resist by, as I said, by remaining silent. So you go to the doctor and say, well, how are you feeling? You say nothing. And the doctor will then say to you, you don't seem to want to talk to me. Why are you being quiet? Why are you being silent? It's very, very difficult to maintain silence in the face of the machinery all around us that wants us to talk, that wants us to confess, that wants us to do all these things. So, yeah, back to your original question, I think the people who don't wear masks are just as agentic as people who do, even though in health terms it may not be in their long-term interests, but hey, this thing's much more important than health. And the disciplinary power is much more important than health. Disciplinary power is much more important than sovereign power. I mean, things that are so suffused across the world that our whole identity and our whole worlds are dominated by these forces, if you like. And it seems to me that we should acknowledge and recognize those forces. Yeah. Anyway.
Right. So they are expressing agency, and in their claims of agency, they are rejecting asymptomatic kinds of aspects of the coronavirus, but they are expressing that autonomy in a way that could have an impact on the collective, because it's not just simply that you could get sick, it's that you could get other people sick.
Yeah, yeah.
Right? So
yeah.
It's that self-regulation and that need to have autonomy and that need to have agency produces massively contradictory kinds of forces, right? The system wants us to self-regulate, but only to a point, right?
Yes, it's true. You're right that in a way, the person who refuses to wear a mask, if the surveillance forces are working efficiently, will get them to talk about why they're not doing it. The newspaper reporter will go to them, the news channel will say, why are you not doing it? Their doctor will ask them why they're not doing it. Their family, their friends, their neighbors will all ask them, why are you not wearing a mask? So this person will be subjected, I suspect, to greater surveillance forces, i.e. invitations to confess, than other people. And of course they can resist for a while, but eventually, and they might develop a narrative about why they're not doing it, but they will be forced to develop a narrative. They can't say, I'm not wearing a mask because for no reason. They've got to say, because I don't feel I'm susceptible to the virus, or I think this interferes with my freedom. They will have to articulate the reason for their autonomy, and that is part of being autonomous, is articulating those reasons that you have, even though you and I might think, well, that's not a very good reason, but if they can articulate a reason, that's the important thing in the surveillance machinery, as long as you can continue to confess. So some people confess the most crazy things, and I think, oh, this is a bit mad, but it's their confession that counts. The fact that they are doing it, never mind what they talk about. Patients or people out there, they say they confess to amazing things, and you think this is bizarre, but they're doing it. That's the important thing. Never mind, it's not for me to judge the content of what they're confessing. It's all I've got to do is encourage them to do more of it. That was a bizarre thing you just said. Would you like to amplify that? Could you say a bit more about that? Tell me. Go on. Yes, good idea. Yes, go on. And so we have these techniques for eliciting from people. And nowadays, in medical school, we trained. 50 years ago, when I qualified, there was no training in communication skills. And now there are whole courses on how to talk to patients. What do you mean, how to talk to another human being? Don't we know how to do that? We don't. It's a bit like the physical education. You've got to be taught how to move your body. You've got to be taught how to speak to people, how to encourage them to confess, how to, and so on. So, yeah, this is the world we live in.
Very, very interesting. So, last question. You've written about the emergence of private space within people. We've been talking about this, enabled by the presence of surveillance. It produces an ironic tendency in people to see surveillance necessarily as an intrusion. So this emergence of private space is happening because of surveillance. But then at the same time, people are saying, but you're intruding on me by surveilling me. So surveillance produces creative forces within us, but then we're bothered by it because we think it's intrusive. Yeah. So I was wondering if you could explain what you mean by that.
Yeah, well, this thing on private space I'm still working on, but it's coming on. First of all, I try to look for when did the concept of private space that we have in our heads, because there is a difference between public and private space, as in the public market square versus the home is a private space versus public. But here I talk about private space as being something inside your head, and the earliest reference I can find to that is the early 20th century, the idea that people have a private space that's their own.
Right.
And
Virginia Woolf.
That I know. And what intrigued me particularly is in about this sort of developed very slowly in the 20th century, but in this paper what I want to explore is how that private space was threatened. And there are a number of threats that emerge in the 1950s to that private space when forces were getting inside your head. And the examples I would come up with would be brainwashing in the Korean War, where people got inside your head and took over your head. McCarthyism in the States, where the Reds were crawling from out of your bed on getting into your mind.
Yes.
There was the Invasion of the Body Snatchers, that sort of film where the aliens come down from outer space and get into your head and take over your head. There's a whole idea of advertising, the hidden persuaders, the subliminal advertising and things. The advertisers are getting into your head. So
sorry, David, I just watched Harry Potter #5 for the first time yesterday. Sorry to interrupt you.
Yes, go on. Yes.
One of the big things is that Voldemort is trying to get into Harry's head.
Yes.
He's trying to become Harry.
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt you. But
yeah, maybe I should use that in my paper. Yes, but that's right. Because why were people concerned in the 1950s in all these different ways? And they weren't the same discourse. I mean, people who were concerned about brainwashing weren't necessarily concerned about aliens from outer space. I mean, there was just different discourse. Quite independently, all these discourses arise in the 1950s about someone taking over your mind. Mm-hmm. Why did that just occur? Because you had a mind. For the first time, you had a private space, an independent mind. Mm. So suddenly you could be concerned about people getting into it. And so nowadays, when we're concerned about social media and big tech and everything getting inside our minds, the only reason we can be concerned about that is because we do have private minds. So it's a manifestation, seems to me, evidence that we do have now private minds, because we're concerned about somebody getting inside our minds. Somebody, the Russians getting inside the Americans' minds so they elect Trump or something. Is this happening? I mean, I doubt if this is really happening, but it's this sort of the paranoia about things getting inside your mind, for me, tells me we do have a private mind. And it's that privacy that we have, which has emerged over the last 50 years, which we value so much because it's part of our autonomy, part of our agency, and so on. So this makes us who we are. And therefore, ironically, we then object to this surveillance of people trying to get in there. But it's the very fact that people are trying to get in there which makes it what it is, which constructs it what it is.
Very, very fascinating. I understand now much better your view on that. That's really interesting. So we are now at 57 minutes. I was wondering if you could just summarize everything we've said and answer the question of the discussion, which is, how does surveillance change who we are? Can you just give a few points of summary on that?
Yes, a very, very brief précis. So it seems to me starts with the Panopticon and that surveillance machinery. That was a machinery, as I said, it was just a building. It was never built, but it's the relationship of those gazes of who is being observed. Yes. Instead of the king being observed, the ordinary person was being observed. And that was a breakthrough in sort of technology, if you like, Western technology, which then permeated 19th century society in all its manifestations, prisons, workshops, schools, and so on, hospitals, as I've described. And then in the 20th century, we get a sort of speeding up of that surveillance machinery. So instead of being confined to these architectural spaces, it opens up into the whole community. So the whole, potentially everyone all the time can be surveyed. And we found the techniques, first of all, emerging in schools with children, both physical and mental surveillance, and then it expands up into everybody. So we've created a world where we have changed who we are, which I think gets us near the end of the...
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the fact that we self-regulate.
Yes, I should have said that was the final thing. We become self-monitoring, self-surveying people. That's important.
We patrol ourselves.
Yeah, exactly.
For a variety of different reasons. It's not necessarily in any society the same, or in any community the same, or even for any person. Yeah. The significance of the self-regulation, or the reasons for it, the motivations, are all different and quite individuated themselves. But Yeah, I just find it very fascinating, and also our subjectivity will affect it. So if we, depending on our racial background, our ancestry, our linguistic background, cultural, or our gender orientation, will affect the degree and the ways in which we self-regulate, and why we do that. So this has been a really fascinating discussion. I really thank you so much for joining me on this inaugural podcast episode, Apt to be Rapt, because I am very, very fascinated by your work. I'm fascinated by just everything that you said today, and your articulation of the complexities of self-identity and surveillance, and the way that they come to co-create each other. So, David, it's been wonderful talking with you, and thank you so much. And thank you to everyone watching. We will be presenting different episodes of Apt to be Rapt whenever we can. Okay, thank you very much. My name is Aurora Elms, and this is Dr. David Armstrong from King's College London. Thank you.
Thank you for hearing my confession.